Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a fantastic edition of the Sherlockian interview. Tonight, we're going to be talking about dark arts and dark acts with Orlando Pearson. My name's Steve Emmett, and I'm the founder of MX Publishing. I'm going to do a little introduction to MX, and then we're going to be straight into talking to Orlando. So, MX Publishing was founded 15 years ago, and we're the largest Sherlock Holmes publisher in the world. We've got about 150 authors writing for us and well over 500 books now, a couple of million books out there in various different formats, print, ebooks, audiobooks, and we've been doing some art and various other bits and pieces. We're a social enterprise and we support three key causes, the Stepping Stones School in the UK, Happy Life Children's Home in Kenya, and the United Nations World Food Programme. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of those, we'll keep it relatively brief. Stepping Stones School is hosted at Undershaw, which is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's former home. It's a school for children with learning disabilities, and we've been working with them for a little over a decade. And I became a patron 5 years ago in 2016. We've raised actually a little over $85,000 now for the school, and we do some events and awareness down at the school. In fact, we've had a play with Orlando actually at Undershaw itself. We'll talk a bit more about the plays in a moment. Happy Life Children's Home is a baby rescue project in Kenya, and we've been working with them for nearly a decade. Sharon and I are mentors. So Sharon is my wife, also a co-founder of MX Publishing. And we've spent every Christmas out there with the kids, about 150 kids now, apart from this last Christmas. And sadly, this Christmas as well will be postponed due to COVID. But we've been working with them on events, awareness projects. We had a fantastic project under COVID last year where we funded the planting of 1,000 trees. And this year we're working on a school book project. Another wonderful organisation we've been working with is the United Nations World Food Programme. And I work as a tech accelerator mentor for the last 4 years. Sharon's also a marketing mentor in the last year. We participate in the boot camps, which are usually in Munich, but they're online at the moment. And we're very, very proud to have been part of the team that won the Nobel Peace Prize last year in 2020. One of our biggest projects is the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories. It was launched 6 years ago. We're just about to launch volumes 28, 29, and 30. It's the biggest collection in the world. It has a lot of very famous people participating in it. Over 500 stories. Over 8,000 pages every year. We also have a project which Orlando's been quite heavily involved in, which is Dear Homes. This is a wonderful subscription service in America, which enables people to have a letter every week from that was copied from the letter that goes to Sherlock Holmes, and you have the chance to be solve the solution to the case and try and beat Sherlock Holmes to the solution. So we've been working with them now for nearly 3 years. So I think it's about 30 cases we've done with the team in the States. We also have an art project partnered with the Conan Doyle estate, the family estate of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and we've created 56 pieces of art with different artists from around the world, and 4 books so far as part of that project. We also work with foreign publishers, and about 40 of our novels have been translated into Italian with the big publishing house there, Mondadori. And on to Orlando. So the Redacted Sherlock Holmes series, so far, I will say so far, because volume 7 is underway. 6 volumes of short stories, print, ebook, and audio. Several of them have been translated into Italian, and we've actually got 2 now in German, I think, Orlando, if I remember right. Several of them have been adapted into plays, which have been performed live in London theatres, but also online as well underneath the pandemic. So I'm going to move in swiftly into the first slide. So Orlando, good evening.
Good evening.
I see you're in Baker Street, sort of.
I'm sort of in. It's rather a furrick in Baker Street. I'm actually in quite a Holmesian place because I'm in the southwest of London, and lots of the Holmes cases took place around here. So the next train station down from my one is Esher, and it was at Esher that Sherlock Holmes organised the rescue of Mrs. Burdett in Wisteria Lodge. I'm not far from, it's on the same line as goes down to Woking for the Naval Treaty, and also not far from Leatherhead, which is the Speckled Band. When I'm in Leatherhead, I look out carefully for swamp adders just to make sure I avoid them.
Fantastic. Well, this is your new work. I really love your covers because I always start with a game of trying to work out who all the people are on there. Now, I usually get one at least because, of course, you've got Holmes there on the right-hand side. But I must admit, this one I found pretty tough. I only got two of the other characters that are on here. So, do you want to take us through who's on the cover this time?
Yeah, it's quite an eclectic collection. So, the top row, I suspect most people are going to get Churchill and Stalin. And the chap on the right is Joseph Goebbels, who's I don't like using the word favourite, but he's a good person to use in novels. In stories. He's very quotable, and he really isn't very nice. Now, it's not often. I remember when I did a front cover with Mozart and Saddam Hussein on, and I commented to you, I don't think many other book covers feature both Mozart and Saddam Hussein. The person on the left in the second row is P.G. Wodehouse. And then to the right of him is one no one's going to get, I suspect, and that's a railway worker in Berlin in the 1930s and 40s. And the bottom line has, from the right, an actress who appeared with Fred Astaire. In the middle, a former British Foreign Secretary who actually, it was only after I started writing that I discovered he looked exactly like Dr. Watson as painted by Paget. And then in the bottom left-hand corner is a former US ambassador to the UK.
So it's set around 1940, 1941. How old would Holmes and Watson be at that point?
Well, Holmes is described in his final bow as being 60. That was in 1914. So in 1940, he's 86, but he's very trim 86. I assume Watson was about the same age. Watson fought in the Battle of Maiwand in 1880. And by that time, he'd also, also qualified as a doctor. He and Holmes must have been about the same age. They're about 86. I don't see they don't run and fight in these stories, but in my stories, but they don't fight and run all that much in the Conan Doyle stories either. So Holmes runs as fast as a man has ever been seen to run in The Hound of the Baskervilles, and there's the odd fight as in The Solitary Cyclist, but actually most of it's cerebral. I don't see any reason why they shouldn't have been around in 1985 and 6.
And if we move on to the back cover, if I can get the slide to work, it has Mycroft on it. What was that?
Well, Mycroft would have been 93 by then, but we seem to be having older leaders these days. I think that Joe Biden's 76, Trump was 70, and in this story, Churchill was 65 and Stalin was 62. So, and that was an older that was an older age in those days, particularly since both Churchill and Stalin drank and smoked perhaps more than was entirely good for them. And people who are not sure whether Holmes, Watson, and Mycroft were around in 1940, 1941, I better provide death certificates to prove that they weren't around. In the absence of death certificates, I'm going to assume they were still around. And Mycroft Holmes is the only person cleverer than Sherlock Holmes. So of course, Churchill would have used Mycroft Holmes services in 1940 and 1941.
So the eagle-eyed that will have seen the other covers will have seen the fact that this says the word novel on the front. So all of the previous stories were short stories. So this isn't another collection of short stories. This is a long format for the first time.
That's correct. So this is my debut in the long format. This is a story which has a serial killer, and it is a story about events that still shape life today. And I felt that only a novel would do something like that justice. And I have to say, I found writing a novel quite hard work. It's taken me best part of a year to research and produce this, but I've restored Holmes and Watson to the events that people will think they know about, and all I've done is really correct the redaction of history, which is why the series is called the Redacted Sherlock Holmes. It restores Sherlock Holmes, and in this case, Mycroft Holmes and Dr. Watson, to events from which historians have chosen to redact them, and I've corrected that redaction. Hello?
You hear me, Orlando?
I can hear you. My green screen seems to be playing a few tricks.
Yeah,
Shall I try and correct it?
We're having some fun with the internet tonight. The storyline here is really fascinating, with Holmes and Watson forced pretty much to go after a serial killer. Are all the events you're describing real?
Yeah, I like to think that my stories are almost completely unoriginal. That all I do is put Holmes and Watson into true events, and that's more the case here than ever before. These are real events, and I've spoken to people who are around for these real events. So there's a description of civilian flight in 1940-41, and I got from talking to my father. There's descriptions of wartime life actually in Switzerland, which I got from talking to my mother. My mother's from Switzerland, and I've spoken to her about it, and it really wasn't much fun in Switzerland. Switzerland was completely surrounded by Axis powers, and food was very short, and so was material to heat the house and to cook. And I know that in the winter of 42-43, and that were the hardest winters of the last century, most houses in Switzerland just had one warm room, which they heated with a single fire, and left the rest of the house cold. And you can imagine how much fun that was in -20. I've drawn a little bit from a fascinating book I read called The Past Is Myself by a lady called Christabel Bielenberg. And Christabel Bielenberg was married to a German and spent the Second World, was an English woman. She was born Christabel Burton. She was married to a German and spent the war in a mixture of Bavaria and Berlin. So an interesting time and place to be. Once again, not a great deal of fun. And I'm also indebted to a neighbour of mine, who I hope is on this call, who advised me of the story of the serial killer who was at work on the Berlin commuter lines in the winter of 1940-41. And I've read a book about that by a man called Scott Andrew Selby, which I can strongly recommend. It's called The S-Bahn Killer, and Selby's account omits the appearance of Sherlock Holmes to investigate the case, but it was a real event, and all the events there, you can see all those people are real. There is none of it made up, this is all true. And there is a health warning attaching to my stories. Not health warning, not just because of the smoking, but there's also drug taking and a sex scene, and the sex scene is derived from the canon. And not only do I have a sex scene, but Holmes and Watson both get embraced passionately by the same person. So that it's quite iconoclastic in its own way, this story.
Well, you do like to court controversy with some of your stories already before, Orlando. Especially the Brexit one was a lot of fun. You also have P.G. Wodehouse in here, which I think is a really interesting connection, because P.G. Wodehouse actually co-wrote some plays with Bertram Fletcher Robinson, who was the plot producer for Hound of the Baskervilles. So Wodehouse and Fletcher Robinson were both friends of Doyle.
Oh, that's news to me. Conan Doyle, Wodehouse was a huge fan of Conan Doyle's writings. Wodehouse was living as a tax exile in France in 1940, and he was captured by the Germans. He was taken prisoner by the Germans, and he spent most of the war in Berlin. There weren't many Brits in Berlin. Christopher Bielenberg was another, but Wodehouse also spent the war in Berlin, and he rather blotted his copybook while he was in Berlin. You can read about that in my story. And he was never allowed to return to England after the war. And my story explains why that was, and what his motivations were for blotting his copybook.
On the back cover, there's another character there. So can you tell us who that is?
Yeah, that's Niccolo Machiavelli. I was lucky enough to have the chance to learn Italian at university, and Machiavelli was one of the writers that I read, and he's one of the great influences on my writing, apart from Arthur Conan Doyle. So I started off inspired partly by Franz Kafka, who I also read at university, and Kafka writes lots of very mysterious stories, and I get Sherlock Holmes to solve the mysteries that Kafka poses. And a lot of my writings are about politics and realpolitik. And I haven't been able to get Machiavelli to appear in the story. He did die in 1527, and so his death is reasonably well attested, unlike that of Holmes and Watson. But it's a theme I picked up in several of my plays, where people use tactics which you'll find in Machiavelli's masterpiece, The Prince. And what's rather frightening is that the tactics Machiavelli proposes, often through Mycroft, seem to pay off. So the objectives that Mycroft has is achieved by Machiavellian means. And it's a theme I've used several times before, but it's particularly strong here. And my story is full of quotations from other people. So there's quotations from Wodehouse and from Churchill and from Stalin and from Goebbels and from the US ambassador. And there's also quotations from Niccolo Machiavelli, because that he drives, Machiavellian politics drives a lot of the story that I've told.
So in terms of this particular novel, there's an overarching theme running through it, and does it cut across to your other short stories?
Yeah, I've used a lot of M's. I've used Mycroft, I've used Machiavelli, I've used murder, there's a scene in Moscow, and there's lots of M's in my story. The one word I don't use is morality. My stories are often very amoral or immoral, and they show things like they are, as does Machiavelli in his writing. Machiavelli is very much about what things are. And so in volume 5 of the redacted Sherlock Holmes, there's 3 short stories in a row, which are all about ends and means, and what means should you use to achieve your ends. And I like to think that my writings are quite uncomfortable for the means that people use. Means is another word that begins with an M, to achieve their ends. And it's often said that Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle is comfort literature. I'd like to think that what I write isn't really comfort literature. It's meant to disconcert, because an amoral approach to a problem is the one that seems to deliver the goods. And you may decide that the ends are worth those means, but I'd like to force people to make that choice.
And if people want to get hold of the book before the release in November, because it's coming out on the 22nd of November, if I remember right, is there a way they can get it early?
Yeah, the 22nd. The novel opens on the 22nd of November, 1940. So 22nd of November is launch date 81 years after the event. but the novel is available on Kickstarter. You can log on to Kickstarter under Dark Arts, Dark Acts, and you can pre-order a copy. You'll get, there's various offerings, quite attractive offerings on Kickstarter if you go onto it to have a look. So the Kickstarter purchases will be delivered probably in the first half of October. The book will go live will be launched on the 22nd of November, and there'll be an audio version, I'm hoping, in the first quarter of next year, read by Keith Spilsbury, who's a real linguist. He's narrated 2 of my stories in German. So he'll be able to deal with this works in English. I'm hoping that there'll be some foreign versions of it, but Keith will be doing the audio version of it in the new year.
Yeah, well, audio definitely is the fastest growing format of publishing, certainly in 2021. It's definitely extremely popular under the pandemic. I think we'll drop into the Q&A part of the evening now. So we've got quite a few fans online. I noticed that we have multiple countries represented as well. So if everybody who's online can ping us in the chat and let us know where you're dialing in from, that would be wonderful. We have, I can see we have Douglas from Beaufort in the US. We have Jean-Christophe from Paris in France, Tammy from Pennsylvania in the States. So if you have questions for Orlando, if you want to pop them into either the Q&A window or into the chat window, that would be great. I've got a few for you as well, Orlando. I think that the first one really is, you mentioned a little bit that this was tougher than writing a short story, and it's taken you a long time to research. Did you find it more enjoyable than a short story?
That's an interesting one. I'm very grateful to my neighbour for drawing my attention to the serial killer. To have Holmes and Watson in a very alien world in Berlin in 1940, it's about as far removed from the comfortableness of Victorian London as you can imagine, and have them applying their principles in such an alien place was fun. I did enjoy the research. Some of it was stuff that I've looked at years ago. I've always been fascinated by the Second World War, and so I enjoyed using some of that in this. But it's much harder to keep a novel under control, particularly when the dates have got to work. So all the dates are genuine, all of them work. The killings that I describe all took place on the days that I've said, but to get the dates all to work is actually quite tough, and to get the research to make it both new and interesting what I hope is interesting. I found quite tough. So it says the cover there says the audio novels. I'm hoping to I have an idea for another novel, but it'll be a while. I think it's certainly I found it quite demanding, I have to say.
And my next question really is around some of the location description around Berlin. So you describe Berlin as if you've been there several times. Have you frequented Berlin in obviously you didn't do it in the 40s, you're not that old, but
I may feel that old sometimes, not quite. I'm lucky. I've travelled quite a lot, both privately and on business. I've been to Berlin several times. I got a lot of the descriptions of Switzerland from my mother, who's German Swiss, and Berlin from being there, from the Christopher Bielenberg book, which I can recommend almost as strongly as my own, and Moscow. I read around. I've never been to Moscow, but I did originally think of calling this story A Tale of Three Cities, because it's mostly set in London, Berlin, and Moscow. But I felt that wasn't quite exciting enough, not Machiavellian enough. Machiavelli's about the dark arts, and so I changed the title, and people have been quite positive about that, which is nice. But a lot of it is based on reading and being there and talking to people.
And have you got a thought of where you're going to, location-wise, where you're going to take Holmes and Watson next?
I'm writing a short story at the moment, which is very London-based and takes him to Highgate Cemetery, amongst other places. My other idea for a novel would take him to northern France in 1918. Also quite a difficult time to be in northern France, but that's I've got a first chapter there. I've got a bit more.
Well, one of the great things about Holmes and Watson is there's such a great time period that you can set them from late 1880s all the way through to the 1940s, I guess. So there's
the Highgate Cemetery story is set in 1869, so it's Holmes's first case, and obviously there must come a limit at some point, but this is 1940-41. I have actually done a story which is partly set in 1946. So that he's in his early 90s, but he's still very lively.
Now you've done a few plays, several in fact, and I hear a rumor that you're planning another one, Orlando.
Well, it's been an absolute thrill doing the plays. We've had lots of attendees. We've had well over 100 logins, so I would guess 200 people watching. I think there are 14 countries. We've done 3 plays so far. One, a sketch in which the Almighty comes to visit Sherlock Holmes. One, a reworking of Macbeth. And one about a little-known hero of the 1930s. And people who've seen my play or read the story say, I've never heard of this guy, but he really was a remarkable man. And I'm happy to announce we have a political scandal coming up in December the 11th, if your diaries, the same people as who appeared in as who appeared in a scandal in Nova Alba and in The Baron of Wimbledon, and this one's going to be called A Perilous Engagement, and it's partially romantic, partially political, and it's based on events that happened in this country. It's based on 2 separate stories, events that happened in this country about 10 years ago and a famous romance. And I combine the 2 in my story.
Fantastic. And there's a question from Tammy. It's something she's always been interested in for those who do intense research. How do you organize your research? Do you research a particular character and have that in a set of notes, or do you have a location, or how do you structure your research notes?
I think it starts off getting an idea, and this story started with the idea suggested by my neighbour of the serial killer in Berlin, and I researched that thoroughly, and I then saw which characters were featuring. And so the person who was most actively involved from the Nazi hierarchy in the investigation of the Berlin serial killer was Goebbels, who was the Gauleiter of Berlin, so the regional leader of Berlin. So that brought him in, I researched him. But I felt that there wasn't quite, just to have the serial killer on his own, there wasn't quite enough material. It would have been a bit too derivative. But obviously the winter of 1940 through to the summer of 1941, when the killer was at his most active, is one of the seminal moments of history. It's a time which decides things that still are in place today and will affect us for years and decades to come. So I researched, my research spread out from there, and I researched more and more of the people, and I found I had a number of moments when I said, "Gosh, I really didn't realise that." And there's a moment close to the end which I think people will read and think, "I can't believe that's true. He's made it up," and I really haven't. There is a moment in the end which I have not made up, and it will make people's jaws drop when they read it, because I didn't see it coming.
And in terms of your favourites of Conan Doyle's original writings, you've covered you've linked many of them into your own short stories. Do you have any particular favourites within the canon?
I think if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I'd have said the Bruce Partington plans, because I spent a lot of time traveling in the London Underground. To have a story about it, which is really a brilliant story, is rather exciting. And whenever I go past Gloucester Road station, I think about the Bruce Partington plans and make sure that the roof of my carriage is suitably curved so you can't put a body on it. My very first story drew very heavily on the Red-Headed League. When I reread the Red-Headed League, I did think that it's the funniest of the stories. I think the Red-Headed League is now my favourite. This story draws very heavily on lots of stories in the canon. So I mentioned one of the striking things about this story, this novel, is that almost all the characters, apart from Goebbels shows no knowledge of the original Sherlock Holmes stories, but Churchill, Stalin, Woodhouse, they all obviously have a deep knowledge of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and so you will find references not only to the well-known ones like the Bruce Partington plans, or like the Red-Headed League, but also the Mazarin Stone. I think for most people, the Mazarin Stone is the least favourite of all the stories. But actually, the Mazarin Stone is there's a scene in the Mazarin Stone that's quite relevant to this story, it might cause you to look back and reread the Mazarin Stone, which I've always thought is. Someone once said it's the worst short story ever written. I don't think it is. It's probably the worst short story that's ever been permanently in print, because it's written by Conan Doyle about Sherlock Holmes. But I do draw the Mazarin Stone in this one.
Yeah, it regularly comes the bottom of the polls when you have the canon stories ranked.
Yeah, no, I did a ranking. I put it bottom. I put Red-Headed League at the top, and I put the Mazarin Stone at the bottom. But there is a disguise that Holmes adopts in the Mazarin Stone appears in this story, and so it all seems quite relevant. Everyone who Sherlock Holmes meets has read all the stories and knows them backwards, which is just as well, really.
Fantastic. And reaching out to the audience, is there any other questions that you'd like to ask Orlando before we wrap up? I'll give everybody a chance to type on the chat. I'll explain that reference to P.G. Wodehouse, by the way, Orlando. So he wrote 4 plays, comic kind of plays that were very satirical and referencing news of the time. So you would quite like them, actually. I think they were sort of satirical of the day. They had nicknames for each other, P.G. Wodehouse and Bertram Fletcher Robinson. And Bertram Fletcher Wodehouse called Bertram Fletcher Robinson Bobbles. So, JC, do you want to pop a question into the chat window or into the Q&A? All the way from Paris. Douglas also has his hand up, but I think that's from the beginning. Not sure if actually, let's see if we can open up the microphone for JC. I'm opening up your microphone, JC, so you should be able to say hello. That's if your microphone's working. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Very good, Jean-Christophe. So Jean-Christophe is part of the Sherlock Holmes Society of France, Orlando, and we've had beers at the Gare du Nord.
Yes, yes,
sure. On a few occasions. You have a question?
Did you have a play? What is your next play after this book?
The next, I'm producing a play on the 11th of December called The Perilous Engagement. I will be playing Mycroft Holmes in that. You'll have seen some of the players previously. We have a new lady playing Jean Leckie. We have Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and we have a member of Parliament called Ignatius Foley, which are Conan Doyle's second and third names. Well, Foley was the married name, was the maiden name of his mother. And that's on the 11th of December. We start rehearsals in 2 weeks. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, good. Very good.
Fantastic. And that'll be online. So we'll enable everybody from around the world to dial in and via Zoom and watch. So much, Orlando. This has been a fascinating interview.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
Thanks to everybody who joined us online.